I'm hoping this is on. Perfect. So I was talking to Stacy earlier, and she said curated spontaneity, right? That was the term. And so I figured I'd do some extra remarks because I just kind of wanted to join in on this moment to talk about our dear friend Susan. So now I just met Susan this morning, but I'll tell you, I shook her hand this morning. And so if I drop the clicker while I'm talking, you know what happened, right? But Susan also was generous enough to walk me around downtown. And it was a nice warm summer day today. And I don't know, has anybody here ever walked around with Susan downtown? You walk around and people are like, hey, how are you doing? It was like a homeless guy. He's like, Susan! And then I swear it was like a bald eagle. It was like, cool, Susan! It was crazy. So those are that was my, just a little curated spontaneity. That was not part of my prepared remarks. So, well, thank you all for coming out. This is awesome. I just really appreciate Susan bringing me, to have a discussion with 700 of your closest friends. Appreciate that. And what we're going to talk about today, what we're going to discuss today is promoting social equity downtown and leveraging public-private partnerships to do that. And I think I put my Instagram, Twitter handle on there, so anybody's social media, let's have at it. So we'll just talk about these things. And, how I want to start is just to show you a little visual. Because as kind of private sector professionals, as folks who are working downtown, sometimes we kind of get a bad rap. Sometimes we get attacked for things that we say, well, like I don't have anything to do with those issues. I didn't cause those problems, so people are attacking us. So I want to tell you a little story about sort of this picture, but before I tell you this story, I want to actually tell you another story. Has anybody ever heard the story of the scorpion and the frog? I see a couple of hands here, but it's relevant. Work with me. So there's a scorpion and a frog, and they're standing at the banks of a river. And the frog's about to jump in, and the scorpion says, hey, Mr. Scorpion, like I can't swim, so can I quickly just jump on your back, and you'll like swim across the river, and we'll both get to the other side, and that'd be great for me, and I'd be appreciative. And the frog says, well, Mr. Scorpion, like, won't you like sting me? So like that would be, it wouldn't be a good look in rap parlance. And so the scorpion says, well, Mr. Frog, if I sting you, like while you're swimming across, like we'll both die. So that doesn't make any sense. I wouldn't do that. And the frog's like, that's a good point. So Scorpion gets on the frog's back, the frog's like swimming across the river, and the scorpion turns and stings the frog. And as they're falling to their deaths and they're about to die, the frog turns to the scorpion and says, Scorpion, why'd you sting me? And the scorpion says, it's my nature, it's what I do. And I tell that story because oftentimes as private sector real estate developers, any real estate developers in the audience? Might be a few. As private sector employers, we sometimes get beat up for doing what we do, the thing that we were built to do, for our stakeholders, for our shareholders, for our employees, for our principals. We're just doing what we do. As a real estate developer, I build buildings, I make places, I try to revitalize neighborhoods. I didn't create some of the issues that I get beat up for, and just like the scorpion, it's sort of like you beat me up for doing what I do. So I like to tell that story as kind of a backdrop when we talk about promoting social equity, partially because sometimes in that context you start to say to yourself, well, you know what? If I'm going to get beat up about affordable housing and transportation issues and workforce issues and the like I'm just going to throw up my hands. Like, I'm tired of getting beat up for things that I didn't create. I didn't start these macro issues. And so you just say to yourself at some point, well, you know what? Maybe I should just ignore all those things. And what I want to talk to you today as a starting point, because sometimes I think we hear and talk about issues of social equity and they just dive into doing it. And no one ever talks about, well, why? Why as a private sector professional, as a private sector employer, as someone who's interested in downtowns, why should I worry about promoting social equity at all? And so I want to talk to you today about that, and I'm going to give you reasons why we need to kind of get our ducks in a row when it comes to promoting social equities throughout the city, but in particular the downtown. And I'll try to leave you with a little alliteration, and I'll call it the 3 M's. The 3 M's. So the 3 M's are why we should all, everyone in this room, should really think that promoting social equity, even as a private sector, profit-motivated, and let me say, you'll notice that the 3 M's will not include mission, so you don't need to be mission-oriented to think promoting social equity is important, and it's not a question of morality. So you're not a bad person if you say to yourself initially, you know, I don't really get why I should care. So let's just dive in. The first M is pretty easy. Millennials. Now, anybody here know a millennial? I'm thinking everybody's hands go. Now, anybody here is actually a millennial? They all posted that on social media right now. They're like, I'm a millennial, right? So, curated spontaneity, right? There we go. So, millennials. One of the reasons why we should focus on promoting social equity if we think the revitalization and thriving and inclusive cities, but particularly downtowns, are important, is that millennials are the game in town. Now, how many, I saw some people nodding their heads already. Well, let's just give you a little sort of data point. So 30% of the entire workforce, the largest cohort of all of the American workforce, are millennials. Now, some of you might be saying, 30%, I mean, you know, that's interesting, but I'm really good with the boomers right now, and those Gen Xers are still managing, they're the middle managers, so I don't really need to worry about that because, you know, 30% is not that big a number, right? So, you know, any Game of Thrones fans here? Any Game of Thrones fans? So, you know, these are the whites, by the way, W-I-G-H-T, just in case you're wondering. I had to put that in there. I was like, you're not going to get me on a promoting social equity, and I say white, and people are like, wait a minute. So these undead, right? You know, this is sort of an example of millennials. You're like, oh, 30%, not a big number, but you know, that number is growing, right? So it's kind of like, you know, you get to the point where suddenly you turn around and you realize that in 2025, according to the Pew Research Center, 75% of the workforce will be millennials. 75%. And so if you think about where do millennials want to live, work, and play, you say they want to live where? Downtown. They want to live in what kind of areas? Urban areas. And so if you're an employer and you're thinking, who's going to be my workforce? If you're a real estate developer and you're doing something downtown or in urban neighborhoods, who's going to live, work, and play? You think millennials. And so you're like, well, what does that got to do with promoting social equity? They're just millennials. Well, 40% of millennials today identify as racial or ethnic minorities. Today. So right off the bat, they're looking to move, just like sort of everybody else, they're looking to move places where they see people like them. And millennials are, you know, an interesting group generationally because not only are they looking for people who look like them just as, just in terms of the 40%, but millennials on the whole have some very important priorities. And this was a recent study where they were asked, well, what were the most important things to them? And millennials said equality and equal access to opportunity were the most important things they cared about and were thinking about when they thought about where they're going to go live and where they wanted to work and where they're going to play. And so if you say to yourself, well, I want to be a part of a thriving and inclusive city in a competitive landscape where you're competing against Detroit and St. Louis and all the other cities in the Midwest and the coast, to be a competitive city with the group that's going to be part of your workforce, whether you like it or not, and are going to be the folks that you really want to bring that vibrancy, you got to think about millennials. And if you're thinking about millennials, you need to think about social equity just in terms of your business bottom line. So putting aside morality, putting aside mission, millennials alone should be one reason you should say, I got to think about social equity. But let's give you kind of another. Let's talk about money. Let's talk about margins. And I was looking at a study by PolicyLink, And the thing that this study said is it looked at 118 metropolitan regions around the country. And they looked at, well, let's look at the relative social equity or inequity in these regions and sort of see the results. And it found a direct correlation between the level of equity and the gross domestic product of that area. And so in other words, the economic performance of your city is inextricably intertwined with the economic performance of, the economic performance of your city is intertwined with the level of equity in your city. And so if you have populations and demographics who are having inequitable outcomes, if you have populations where, in the economic growth here, I just looked at some of the data, when you look at it's sort of uneven, right? So the city is doing great. Madison is doing great. The region is doing great. But if you start looking at certain demographics, you see certain demographics, unemployment is still high. And there's just disparate outcomes amongst those populations. But if you take the results of this study, you have to say to yourself, the more there is inequity in Madison, the more there is inequity in whether it's housing, transportation, workforce, training, and the like, the more there's inequity, the economic performance of Madison as a city goes down. And if the economic performance of Madison as a city goes down, what does that do for downtown? Because downtown is both a driver of the city, but how the city is doing is also a driver of downtown. And if you, as a private sector professional, sometimes you're looking to the city to help out or to do the things that the city needs to do. Well, also city tax revenues are totally tied, according to this study, to the level of inequity in the city or in the region. So then when you're thinking about promoting social equity and you're saying, why should I deal with that? You have to say, when it comes down to the economic performance of a real estate project downtown, when it comes down to who's in your workforce, you have to say to yourself, promoting social equity is going to affect my bottom line, and therefore I should be interested in it. Now, some of you might be saying, well, that's just you, Calvin, and that's kind of one study. Well, anybody here familiar with the Urban Land Institute? So Urban Land Institute, 40,000 members worldwide. They do their emerging trend study every year. And so, you don't have to take it from me. So they interviewed 500 industry leaders from around the country. And they also got surveys back from 1,500 of those leaders. And they asked them, what were sort of the 15 most important things they wanted to think about that have just affected real estate for them? And when you got their answers back, what you saw was it sounded a lot like social equity, jobs and income growth, housing costs and availability, social inequality, income inequality. These are our industry leaders when it comes to real estate development, whether it's in neighborhoods or downtowns and the like. And so this is an issue that's on top of the mind. And if the 2018 Emerging Trends Report just came out, and how many of you think that these issues went down in importance? So you understand what the trends are. So this is something that not only you and I in the audience are thinking about, our industry leaders, the folks who are projecting ahead and thinking about trends are saying these inequities are top of mind. And so we need to think about them because they're going to affect our margins, they're going to affect our money, and they're going to affect our businesses. So those were kind of two M's, but the last one, kind of interesting. It might just come up. It might just come up. And so I told you earlier I was going to tell you a little story about this little site. Everybody can read that? Where's my table 86? Can you read that back there? It's a DMI staff, love them to death, just like Susan. Gentrification is racism. So this is a commercial redevelopment site in Washington, D.C., actually a couple of blocks away from a development we just opened, a multifamily building. And all it has in it is pretty much a mostly vacant restaurant. I mean, actually a couple of months prior to this, and I actually took this picture myself, a couple of months prior to this, I went there to get some jerk chicken and some plantains. And they were out of plantains and they were out of jerk chicken. And so I was sort of like, why are you still open? And so about a month or two later, someone came and in white chalk wrote, "Gentrification is racism." Now, it's a commercial site. There's no residents being displaced. There's actually, and this is in Washington, D.C., which is close to 50% African American. So this new building, it's going to be a residential building, is going to have dozens, if not hundreds, of African Americans who are going to move into the building. And so sometimes these issues of social equity, these issues that are macro issues that, you kind of say, well, I didn't create them, I didn't cause them, and actually I'm just doing what I do. I'm a Scorpion. It might just come up. Now some of you are saying, well, I'm a downtown kind of gal, so, this is like residential, like this is not, stuff like, that's not gonna come up in a downtown, that's not gonna happen. And so, you might say to yourself, well, what am I trying to do downtown? Just trying to make it thriving. We walked around and, so you're saying, well, we're going to try to bring very interesting things, lively things, retail, active sidewalk uses. So maybe we'd bring like an art gallery downtown. Art gallery, right? It'd be kind of interesting. Go right next to the Overture Center. And you say, well, these issues of promoting social equity, they won't come up when you open up an art gallery like this one in Los Angeles. Okay, well, that's an art gallery. Those artists, they get a little crazy, right? So art gallery, you say, well, I want to make thriving downtowns, and one of the things that we like to do is coffee shops. And, that's interesting with students and the like. And, a coffee shop really wouldn't be the type of thing that would get protested as a sign of gentrification, as a sign of future displacement, as a sign that's symbolic of social inequities that maybe have nothing to do with the coffee shop owner. And so things might just come up. Things just might come up. And you say to yourself, well, Calvin, I'm really looking closely, and this is a smart audience. So you're like, all of those examples, those are all residential, right? Those, I'm looking closely. That doesn't have anything to do with downtown, right? So, so now you might be in the city of Santa Ana in California. Anybody ever been there? And you might have won a national award. National award is one of the 15 great places in the country from the American Planning Association. And it's for your downtown. It's downtown Santa Ana. They won this award. And you might, as you're getting the award, look in the back of and see people protesting you getting this award. Your downtown getting this award. Because they see even the recognition of your downtown as symbolic of the social inequities that are here, and that now it's really coming. Now the train's leaving the station, and they don't think they're getting on the train. And so even as a downtown, you have to say to yourself, we're doing all these things to make sure we're creating this thriving city, and we're doing all these things to create this thriving downtown. But we have to know that these issues might come up, even if you're downtown. So those are kind of the 3 M's. And I just want to leave you with that for a second. So that's why we should deal with these issues. That's why we can't just throw up our hands and say, well, those are other people's issues and we didn't really create them, so why do I have to deal with them? But we should talk about just solutions and tactics and how do we kind of dig in if we want to dig in. And I like calling that playing offense instead of playing defense, which was sort of the title of this conversation. And by the way, you are a target. That's my second Game of Thrones reference, by the way. Lannister always plays their debts, if anybody knows that. And so we want to talk about the 3 M's, but now in the context of what are we going to do, right, as we get our ducks in a row. Keep that visual in there. And so we're going to play offense, not defense. And, let's say that red is Badger red, right? That's the O for offense right there. So let's just talk about a couple of things and give you a couple of quick case studies and some ideas. And I always, when I think about promoting social equity, and particularly downtowns, there's a couple of places that really downtowns can be most effective and most efficient. Housing, transportation, and workforce, I think, are really places where we can really dig in and actually do things that make a difference and have an impact. So a couple of examples. And anybody here from Detroit in the audience? Detroit? Curated spontaneity, because we just met earlier, right? There you go. But I started and I said the public-private partnership was the tool to help us promote social equity downtown. But actually, I wanted to break something to you. Public-private partnerships, people have heard them called P3s. Well, I'm going to tell you today that the P3 is dead. Now, first of all, I don't know why it's called P3, right? It's like the public and the private sector. Shouldn't it be called P2s? Like, why is it called P3s? But when you look at downtowns and cities that are doing the right things, or strategically and tactically promoting social equity in a way that really creates an inclusive city and an inclusive downtown, it's no longer a P3. It's a term that I think I coined. So if you hear somebody say it, you say, you got that from Calvin. P5s. It's no longer P3s, which really are just the public sector and the private sector, because there's a lot of new players at the table. It's no longer just the public sector and the private sector. It's the nonprofit sector, the DMIs. It's the philanthropic sector. And then there's just individual people. With the power of internet and mobile technology and crowdsourcing and the like, individual people can have an impact on promoting social equity. So I just want to give you a couple examples of how, that typical connection, that collaboration, we say public and private, they're the ones doing things, and there's some new players in town. And it's important because not only are there new players in town, but they have different goals. They have a different mission. If you're at the University of Wisconsin, what's your time horizon on doing a project? How long are you going to be around if you're University of Wisconsin? Forever. Doesn't that change how you do things? How you think about things? When you're like, we're going to always be here. So we're thinking long-term impact in everything we do. And so if the players are different and they think differently on different goals, then they also probably speak differently, have a different language. Anybody here can read that? Hopefully not. But, like I said, it's a different vocabulary and a different language. And so maybe I ask a different question. Does anybody here speak philanthropic? Anybody? Anybody versed in the words of philanthropic? So, if I came up to you and I said, hey, Susan. Hi there. I said, hey, Susan, we really want to do this opportunity that you're talking about downtown. And, my foundation would really love to work with you. But we just want to actually understand, so we want to work with you and we want to make a PRI. And we just want to understand what's going to be the ROI on our PRI, but we want to understand whether there's going to be any unrelated business income that might be taxed, a UBIT. Any of the lawyers in the room go, oh, yeah. It's a different vocabulary, right? So do you speak philanthropic? When you make a deal with a philanthropic organization, a university with a forever horizon and a different timeline, they think differently about what's going to be in that transaction. Speak differently. But also sometimes the financing tools are different, right? And that has its own vocabulary. So does anybody here speak new market tax credits? It's a crazy language, right? So, again, I come up to Susan, I say, hey, I'm a local nonprofit. What you're doing is awesome. One day you should get your own bike rack kind of thing, right? One day. And I say to you, hey, I'm going to go to the CDFI and I'm going to apply to become a CDE so then I can get an allocation so I can make a Qualic in a Qualic B. Do you speak new markets? And so the new players at the table, they have a different mission, they have a different vocabulary, and so we need to be versed in that because the collaborations that are happening, the collaborations that are helping promote social equities downtown are with these new players at the table. Let me give you just a couple examples. And again, this is the sort of 5 of the P5, just so we all have it clear. So first example, and I forgot, those are 3, just to remind me, actually. Now, anybody, the rent is too... I mean, it is, right? It is. It is. So let's just talk about housing, for example, and let's go to the city of Detroit. And so downtown Detroit said, well, what are we going to do to deal with this issue of housing to make sure that as we bring the city back, as we promote Detroit as a place to live, how do we make sure that those inequities that previously existed don't get exacerbated by the things that are happening that are positive. And what happened was an example of a P5 where they said, well, we're going to help people pay. So this was a P5 in a sense that it was the private sector, the nonprofit sector, and the philanthropic sector that got together and said, well, you know what, we're going to help people with the rent because the rent is too darn high. And so we're going to give rental and actually purchase assistance to new residents and use that as a way, and particularly focused on millennials, use that as a way to promote people deciding not to live in the suburbs where they then have to figure out how to get in or have all these extra transportation costs, to give them incentive to move downtown. Public-private partnership, philanthropic, and then just people. And this was one of these programs, it was super successful. 913 people used the program just within 3 years. So that's how many residents is that are now downtown because of that incentive. And it wasn't the public sector and the private sector. Public sector wasn't involved in this at all. So you can see that in Detroit. And so I always say P5, and I talked about the people, and this was an example, there was a key person who was lurking behind all of this, a private sector individual. And so, again, you see these moments now, a single individual can have an outsized impact on a downtown. That's Dan Gilbert, the billionaire owner of the Cleveland Cavaliers, by the way. So that's just one example. But let's leave downtown Detroit and actually go to midtown Detroit. And, anybody here rocking a Shinola like I am from Detroit? There you go. So midtown Detroit. And so they saw similar issues when they were thinking about housing and how to not exacerbate existing inequities. And they said, well, we shouldn't just focus on who's coming. Let's think about who's already here. And so in Midtown, they said, we're not going to help people pay, we're going to help people stay. And again, a different type of collaboration. This was Midtown Detroit, which is just like a DMI, it's a nonprofit. And philanthropic organizations, Kresge, Ford Foundation, they got together and said, well, what the issue we have is there are low-income families and lower-income families and working-class families that ultimately, through the trends that we all know will happen, will get ultimately pushed out. They'll get pushed out because they're renters and now the rent gets raised. They'll get pushed out because they're owners and maybe their property taxes go up. And so they said, well, let's get together, let's pool resources, and let's actually help people stay. And so that's another way you can promote social equity, not just by thinking about who's coming, but helping the people who have always been on the train stay on the train as it moves forward. And so that's Midtown Detroit. And this was a kind of focus on getting down their housing costs to that kind of HUD level of 30% of your income. So it really made it affordable for residents. And one of the things they also did is they said, well, what if we targeted, in particular, low-income residents who maybe could move on to the next level and become homeowners? And some other of these programs do the same thing in terms of college graduates, recent college graduates, which you guys have in abundance. And so when you think about, again, issues of brain drain and say, we want millennials, we want thriving downtowns, and we want the level of inclusiveness that millennials bring, well, if you target a program to recent college grads, then you're going to get some of that diversity built in just by doing that. So that's Midtown Detroit. One last example, and this is the people, Sue Mosey. Anybody meet Sue Mosey? She is just a one-woman army, and she essentially focused on Midtown Detroit before there was actually a nonprofit organization, and then she started it and built it pretty much from scratch over a 20-year period. Sort of like someone we know. So, one last example, and this is a transportation example in downtown Columbus, Ohio. Downtown Columbus, Ohio said, well, there's a lot of focus about housing, but some of the issues of inequity have to do with access to jobs and your ability to leverage transportation and your type of transportation options to get to jobs. And if you're a downtown employer, you're always thinking about, how do I make sure my workforce has the easiest time to get to jobs? And as a matter of fact, I was told earlier today that one of the bigger issues here locally is not necessarily the jobs, it's finding the people to fill the jobs. And that often has to do with whether they can live anywhere near and have the right ways and the best ways to access those jobs. And so what Columbus, Ohio said, downtown Columbus, Ohio said, is we're going to directly deal with this issue. And so we're going to create a partnership that took the private sector and said private sector employers are going to pay in. We're going to get a payroll deduction from some of the employees. And then we're going to get some nonprofits and philanthropic organizations to pool monies. And what we're going to do, we're going to use those funds to give transit cards to the potential workforce, both existing and then offer that out as an incentive. And what they saw, they did a pilot program and saw a 50% increase in the number of bus commuters who were coming from the suburbs and now became part of the downtown workforce. And as a matter of fact, what the philanthropic organizations did is they said, well, we have a lot of new employees who come in and they live paycheck to paycheck and they haven't gotten a paycheck yet. And so what we're going to do is we're going to pay for their transit card, have it be free, and give it to them on their first day on the job. Transportation incentive. And those are the types of things that you can do as a downtown and use, again, these kind of P5 partnerships where it's not just the public sector. Now, the public sector was involved here because the transit authority actually first discounted the cost of the passes before everyone else paid in. So this is a true example of public, private, philanthropic, nonprofit. Now, I didn't mention the people. And so I don't know enough about Columbus, Ohio to really say who is that one person like the Sue Mosey in Midtown or like the Dan Gilbert in downtown Detroit. And so, and every city just doesn't have, as great an example of someone. Not every downtown has a Susan. So those are just, just a couple of case studies. And so when we think about playing offense, case studies are an important part of it, but it's also a point of saying everyone here in this room has to think about what is their role and what are the best practices that you can share and how can you be conveners. And one thing I like to talk about is convening the non choir. And so finding the folks who, when they hear about these issues of social equity, they go, that's not my issue, that's not my bag, I don't want to talk about it, why do I need to deal with it? And we can you can, whether it's small focus groups, whether it's large meetings like this, whether just talking about this discussion today, you have the power to start having those discussions, what I like to call P5 dialogues, because the other thing that needs to happen is, what you don't want to do is, once you have the issue, then go to the foundation at the last moment and say, hey, I need $1 million. What you want to do is to say, hey, we're thinking about issues of housing, we're thinking about issues of transportation, we're thinking about issues of workforce development, access to opportunities and trainings and the like for disenfranchised population. We're thinking about these things. We think it's a good thing. There's some morality in it, but we actually think it's going to affect our margins. We actually think it's good business sense. And you need to have those conversations and start those conversations before you need the money, before you need the transaction, before the deal needs to happen. And so those are the types of things that you and I can do as leaders, as folks playing offense, not defense. Because at this point, you have to understand that we really can't, this has to be strategic. This has to be tactical. It has to be real. It can't be one of those academic things. It can't be like, well, Susan, can we get somebody to write a policy that's groundbreaking? No, what we need to do is actually implement the tactics that get us to the groundbreaking. Now, that's actually a picture of me, by the way, with that shovel. We actually opened that building just a couple of days ago. So, we need to do the things in this crowd, we're the executors. We're the get things done folks. And so we don't want to talk about it. What do we want to be? We want to be about it. And so if we're going to be about it, that also means that we can't just throw up our hands and say, well, we're scorpions. I'm a private sector employer. I employ my workforce. That's what I do. I'm a real estate developer. I do adaptive reuse of downtown buildings. That's what I do. I don't have anything to do with these issues. Well, you do, because they're coming. And if you care about your workforce, then you should care about issues of social equity. If you care about the margins in your projects and you care about who's going to live, work, and play, not only just downtown, but in the city, because millennials are choosing between cities, then you can't throw up your hands anymore. You can't just say to yourself, well, I'm just gonna cover my eyes. I'm just gonna not listen to those stakeholders in darn community meetings. I'm just gonna not say anything when people say, oh, gentrification. We have to step up. We have to no longer just try to defend just doing things the way that we usually do it amongst us scorpions. So we're not going to play defense, we're going to play offense. And actually, all that I'm really saying is, you and I, we have to lead. Thank you.